Hello, everybody. Glad to see you here. It is an exciting evening, and it's hard for me to believe that I'm 83 and I'm the youngest one of the bunch here. And we all used to live in Europe during World War II. It's just incredible. Anyway, the first picture you're seeing is me at age 5. I became a liberated woman at age 5 when my father took me into the streets of our small town in Holland to watch the Canadian soldiers on their tanks and motorcycles, handing out cigarettes and chocolates. The streets turned into one big block party. It was April 13th of 1945. Next slide. For the next several days, my little brother and I, whom you see in the picture, walked in the neighborhood wearing freedom outfits that my mother had made for us during the war from scraps. Next slide. My parents were married in 1939 in Holland, just before Hitler invaded Poland. My father was an attorney on a small island in the southwest of Holland. You see the arrow there pointing to the island. Hitler had signed an agreement promising not to invade our country. Few people believed he would keep his word, and our worst fears were confirmed on May 10th of 1940, when the country woke up to air raid sirens. My parents quickly wrapped their newborn baby in blankets before they rushed into the basement of our old home. I was 3 weeks old. Germany was bombing the city of Rotterdam, and World War II was on our doorstep. Next slide. That's the city of Rotterdam. The center was completely obliterated. A few days later, enemy soldiers appeared in our town, on our island. Next slide. Families were required to take the soldiers into their homes. For days, sometimes weeks, we hosted a couple of German enemy soldiers who slept in our beds, drank our coffee, and used our facilities. My father took on a leadership position in an organization called the Dutch Union, and he made no bones about his hatred for Hitler. The Nazis were assembling a list of troublemakers, like my father. Within a year, the Dutch Union was forced to shut down, but my father continued the work he had started. The handwriting was on the wall. On May 4th of 1942, 2 German soldiers knocked on our door, demanding to take my father to an unknown location. My young mother, who was 24 at the time, was 6 months pregnant with her second child, and I had just 2 years old. I was just 2 years old. Within a few hours, we learned that several hundred men from all over the country were taken from their families that same day in a well-orchestrated coup by Hitler to put the intelligentsia of the nation behind barbed wire. They were taken to an internment camp in the south of Holland, next slide, where the Nazis had confiscated an old Roman Catholic seminary that you see over here. And again, it was behind barbed wire. 3 days after he left, my father called home with permission from the camp commander to let us know where he was and that he would be sending his dirty laundry home every week. From then on, I helped my mother fold my father's clean clothes, and we carried weekly care packages to the post office. Next slide. Here, I'm carrying one of their care packages. The people inside the camp were allowed to have visitors on occasion. One day, my father was asked to come to the reception area. There was somebody who wanted to see him. Dad recognized his older brother by his voice, but not by his looks. His brother had changed his appearance because he was wanted by the Nazis for his role in the Dutch resistance. My uncle handed my father a package with these words, "This cake is from your mother, baked with love." Back in his barracks, Dad found a tool to cut barbed wire that was hidden inside the cake. his brother had given him an instrument to escape the camp. Now, any attempt to escape, however, meant that you had to run for your life. My father was unable to run because he had lost his leg when he was 12 years old in a train accident, and he wore a prosthetic leg. Even if he had been able to run, he would not have wanted to leave, knowing this would have had serious consequences, not just for him, but also for his family. So what was the rationale for the internment camp? Hitler threatened to execute some or all of those in the camp if the Dutch committed crimes against the Nazis. He kept his word. In August of 1944, the first 5 hostages were executed in retaliation for an act of defiance by the Dutch in Rotterdam. Among the 5 who lost their lives were 2 of Audrey Hepburn's Dutch uncles. Next slide, please. As a teenager, Audrey lived in Holland with her Dutch mother. She later became a beloved Hollywood actress. Some of you might remember her. After additional executions of hostages, the international community began to put pressure on Hitler to close the camp. Just before Christmas of 1942, my 35-year-old father was among the first hostages to be released. Next slide. Here's a picture of his homecoming, the first time Dad held his newborn son, who was born in July when his father was still behind barbed wire. I was not so sure what to make of this guy who claimed to be my father, as you can tell. Life after the camp was not easy for my dad. He was coping with survivor's guilt, and his law practice was not bringing in the needed revenue to support his family. So he began to supplement his income with a second job as inspector for the Dutch Red Cross. Fast forward to 1944. In anticipation of an invasion by the Allies, the Nazis had begun to fortify the European coastline from Norway to the south of France. For the Netherlands, they came up with a different plan. They wanted to destroy the dikes and dunes in the southwest of the country to flood that area with salt water from the Atlantic Ocean. That area happened to be where we were living. Rumors have been going around for weeks, but nobody, needless to say, wanted to believe that that was going to happen. But in February of 1944, we were given 2 weeks' notice to evacuate. Everyone was urged to travel light and to leave most everything behind. Show you the next picture of the island. The Red Cross showed up to help with the massive undertaking of the evacuation, and they counted everyone, including myself, as a victim of war crimes. Our family left the island with 8 suitcases, feeling like refugees, homeless, and without income. What to do? Next slide. Both sets of grandparents lived in homes large enough to accommodate our family for the time being. While we stayed with them, my dad made daily phone calls to find work. It didn't take long for him, thankfully. An attorney who knew my father from the internment camp, they had both been there together, was looking for somebody to take over his law practice. Dad, of course, accepted the offer. There weren't many available. It meant that we were going to live in a small town in the northeast of the country. As you can see where the arrow is, we moved from the southwest, from the island, to the northeast, not too far from the border of Germany. Someone offered us a place to stay on the bedroom floor of her home, across the street from a German casino. A month later, on June 6, 1944, the Allies landed in Normandy, well known as D-Day. Surely, everybody thought, we would be liberated before the end of that year in 1944. Wrong. It took another year before Germany surrendered. In fact, the worst of the war was yet to come, believe it or not, caused by extreme weather conditions and military setbacks, such as Operation Market Garden, the battle that took place in Holland just south of where we were living, later filmed as The Bridge Too Far. That last year of World War II in Holland was known as the Hunger Winter of 1944-45, when thousands died of starvation and extreme cold temperatures. Because of shortages of supplies caused by railroad strike, people resorted to eating tulip bulbs. They cut down trees, kitchen cabinets, and furniture to use as fuel. Adults and children were walking across the country through snow and ice in search of food and shelter. Our situation was not much better than where they came from. After D-Day, our town was in the flight path of airplanes that carried bombs from England to Germany. I learned to count by looking at the warplanes that were flying over because the schools were closed. Because the Allies were bombing German targets in our town, the city cut off all gas and electricity. No more cooking at home. My mother and I began to make daily trips to the soup kitchen. I carried the food bucket that contained our only quote-unquote hot meal for the day, a white soup with slivers of something green. The bucket was not insulated, so by the time we came home, everything was cold and I lost my appetite. To make matters more complicated for our family, my mother was pregnant with child number 3. The baby was due in April of 1945. Next slide. This is a picture. This is a true war picture, as you can tell, of our family living on the second floor of that home that somebody invited us to. My brother and I and my father in the picture. During that time, hiding in the basement became a way of life for all of us. We often went to bed in our street clothes. When the Allies dropped a bomb on a German train just 200 feet from our house, our windows shattered. My dad covered them with cardboard, and from then on we sat in the dark during the day. With little to eat and drink, and with the constant fear of danger, our lives were becoming unbearable. Thankfully, the Canadian soldiers liberated us a few days before my little sister was born on April 18th of 1945. The entire country was liberated on May 5th. Next slide. This is pictures of the liberation and the Dutch flag at the bottom, red, white, and blue Dutch flag. And until then, I'd only seen the Nazi flag with the swastika. How did the war impact my life? My behavior had all the signs and symptoms of childhood trauma. But no one in those days knew what that was. My parents told me, "Be glad you're as young as you are, you won't remember." Everyone was in the same boat. We were still in survival mode and it was time to move on. Next slide. That's counting airplanes, and the next slide is, I think, a picture of our family. Yeah, that picture was taken of my family 6 months after the war, where we looked pretty decent by then. I learned to stuff my feelings and became a loner. There was no one to talk to about what I had experienced, with all the flashbacks and nightmares I was still having. At an early age, I started butting heads with my parents, who thought I was a misfit. My low self-esteem lasted well into adulthood, and until age 55, I denied that the war had impacted my life. That changed in 1995. I was already living in Tulsa by then, when the federal building in Oklahoma City was destroyed by the first domestic terrorist attack in this country. I was living in Tulsa watching the aftermath of the drama unfold on television when I heard President Clinton urging parents to pay attention to their children. Out of the blue, a voice inside me said, "No one paid attention to us children during the war." The next day, a friend called me. She had been in Oklahoma City to help with the rescue efforts, And she said to me, "You've never seen anything like it." To which I responded, "Yes, I have. I'm a survivor of World War II." She was as shocked as I was to hear me say that. I had never, ever said that before. The floodgates were opened, and for the first time I began to share my story, but I didn't know if my recollection was accurate. Maybe I was making things up. Fortunately, my parents were still alive, and while Europe was celebrating the 50th anniversary of the liberation in 1995, I visited my parents in Holland to talk with them about the past. It was a relief to know that whatever I remembered had actually happened. I wasn't just making it up. Before I left to go back to Tulsa, my parents gave me a copy of a diary they had kept from 1939 until 1953, which covered most of my early childhood. That diary is now kept in Amsterdam at the Institute of War Crimes of World War II. After the war, my father served as a judge on the Dutch War Crimes Tribunal. We moved back to the island where I was born. German soldiers had lived in our house and left their German dishes. Next slide. Thank you. We used them every day and didn't think much about it, but for my father, they were a constant reminder of the past. When he did the dishes, the swastika that was baked in on the back of the porcelain dishes stared him in the face. He decided to do something about it. With the use of a small pocket knife, he began to remove the Nazi symbol, one day at a time. It took him years, but when the job was done, he felt better. He began to joke around in the mornings when he asked us, "Do you want a kiss from Hitler before I shave? Or a kiss from the Queen after I shave?" Guess what we chose? Next slide, here I end. Let me end here with a quote from Alexander Hamilton: "Who lives, who dies, who tells your story?" Thank you.
Everyone, this is Marcell Binstock, Dr. Marcell Binstock, a retired ophthalmologist. He was born in France in 1935, and let me tell this story.
Good evening, everyone. As he indicated, I was born in Strasbourg, France in 1935. Strasbourg is a city on the border between France and Germany. And it's an interesting city because it's been kicked back and forth between Germany and France over the years. As a consequence, much of the population speaks both French and German. Anyway, in 1939, Hitler invades Poland, and as a consequence, starts the Second World War. France, of course, was opposed to Hitler and went to war against him, but France was totally unprepared for the war and surrendered after something like less than 6 weeks. I remember that just before the surrender, France had anticipated warfare in the city of Strasbourg and evacuated the whole population in order to avoid people getting hurt. We moved to a city close to the Italian border called Grenoble, and resided there in an apartment building. And then the Italian army was in charge of that city. Because Mussolini cooperated with Hitler and the Italian army then was in charge of that particular town. And since we were Jewish, we had to be worried and concerned about what might happen to us, but interestingly, the Italians didn't bother the Jews very much at all. When the Allies, that is the British and the Americans, landed in North Africa, the Germans were concerned that the Italians would not be able to hold on to the city of Grenoble. They didn't trust them to be able to fight vigorously enough to counter the Allied attack. So they asked the Italians to leave and they would take over, which they did. Very shortly thereafter, a lot of anti-Jewish activities began to take place. One of them was that Jews were required to go to the local police station to have their identity cards stamped with the letter J so they could be readily identified as being Jewish. The intent was obviously that eventually they would haul off all the Jews and deport them. My mother, who was a very law-abiding person by nature, went down to the local police station, and a French policeman said to her, "Madame, you're not Jewish, go home." And my mom refused because she was so law-abiding. And she said, "You know, the law says that you have to do that. You have to stamp my identity cards." And he kept saying to her, "Madame, please leave. You're not Jewish." And she kept insisting, and eventually he gave in and did as she required. She came home, told my dad about what happened, and he said, "You know, you should have listened to this policeman because I think that he was trying to tell you something." And he then started looking for us. He felt that it would be too dangerous for us to stay in the city of Grenoble, particularly under German rule, and that we probably best leave that area and try to flee to Switzerland. Switzerland was a neutral country uninvolved in the war. So he found a gentleman who was a guide to help people who wished to flee France, and he organized us to accomplish that event. My sister, who was like 14 years old at the time, was inducted into a Jewish Girl Scout group who was supposed to go visit the Alps near Switzerland, but the real intent was really to get those girls into Switzerland. But officially it felt they were supposed to tell that they were on an outing to visit the Alps. Anyway, my parents then had her join the group, and she left the family. And then my mother, father, and myself were told to get ready to leave Grenoble. This was like in November, and he explained to us that he would take us on a train, and that the train would take us close to the border of Switzerland. However, he said you cannot stay until the train reaches its destination because the German police will arrest you. So you have to jump off the train while it is still moving. Fortunately, it moves in towards the city at a fairly slow rate, and you can probably jump off the train fairly safely. And this is exactly what we did. We were on a train. It was nighttime. He jumped off first, and then my mom jumped, and then I jumped, and then my dad jumped. And we found ourselves in a rural area along the train tracks, and he said to us, you'll have to walk a couple of hundred miles, a couple of hundred yards, sorry, to a river. And when you reach the river, go into the river. He says, don't worry about it. It's not a very deep river. It's very shallow, so nothing will happen. And once you're in the middle of the river, you'll be in Switzerland. So this is basically what we did. Once we were in the Swiss side, we were on a highway. It was dark, and he had pointed out to us the direction in which we were to go towards the city of Geneva. And before I go to that, let's mention the fact that he said, when you walk towards the river, don't stand up and walk, because there are patrols and you could be picked up. So get down on your hands and knees and just crawl towards the river until you reach the river and get into the river. And that's what he did. On our hands and knees, we crawled to the river and got into the river, and then reached the Swiss side. On the Swiss side, it was nighttime. Suddenly, an automobile stopped, and it turned out to be Swiss police. And they wanted to know what we were doing here. And we said, well, we're trying to escape France because we're being hunted by the Germans. And they took us into the automobile, and then they took us to a prison. And they put my dad and I in a prison. My mom, who was originally from Switzerland and spoke the Swiss dialect, they took her away. And they kept her for a couple of days and questioned her, not wanting to know if there was any possibility that she could be a spy for the Germans. She finally convinced them that she could not be a spy for the Germans because she was Jewish. And she had relatives in Switzerland. She had two brothers living there. And the police contacted these people, and we were released from the prison, and she was released also. And they put us into a camp where they were holding all folks that were refugees from the French side. On the camp, we were told not to communicate with anybody outside the camp. But my mom managed to snuggle a piece of paper with the address and phone number of one of her brothers, and said, please, to a lady that was being released from the camp, and said, please, when you get out of the camp, contact this brother of mine and tell him that we made it across, and see if he can get us out of this camp. Which is what happened, basically, and we ended up living in the city of Zurich until the end of the war. While we were still, I'm going back to Grenoble. While we were living in Grenoble, my parents joined the French underground movement, and the apartment in which we were living was then utilized as a safe place for people fleeing the Germans. And interestingly, as a child, I remember every night I had strange people sleeping in my bedroom. So it was a very unusual situation. Also, I remember that we were one of the few families that owned a radio. In those days, not everybody had radios. It was still a relatively luxurious item. So my mom would put the radio on the dining room table, and friends that they trusted were invited to come and sit around the table and listen to the British broadcasting system, which was the only source of real news that we could get. We couldn't get any news from the French because the French were cooperating. The French government was cooperating with the Germans. And so the only reliable news that we could get came out of England. And we got it through the British broadcasting system. And I never forget, as long as I live, how excited everybody around the table was when the news came across that that the Russians had beaten the Germans at the Battle of Stalingrad, because that was the beginning of the major defeats of Germany. And people around the table started getting up and dancing around the table. I still remember that. Anyway, so anyway, we lived in Zurich for 2.5 years, and I went to school there as a kid. And finally, the Allies won the war, and we were able to go back to France. At that point, there was already talk that the United States and the Soviet Union might get into war. So my parents said, "We've had enough of this, let's go to the United States." So they applied for us to come to this country, and finally around 1948, we were given permission to come to this country, and we that's what we did. Came to New York City, and had a very funny experience in New York City. We had to catch a subway in order to get to the apartment that had been rented for us. And it was rush hour. People were rushing in to get to the subway to go home. And a man was lying on the stairs, unconscious. And nobody stopped. People were walking jumping over the man and just keep going. And my dad turned around to us and said, "Welcome to the United States." Anyway, we lived in New York City for a couple of years. No, not for a couple of years, for about a year. And then my dad, since he couldn't speak English, found it difficult to make a living. So somebody said, "You know, if you go to New Jersey, you can purchase a poultry farm and raise chickens, and the chickens don't care if you speak English or not." And so that's what we ended up doing. However, when we got to New Jersey, the prices of farms had risen dramatically because the United States was subsidizing agriculture during the war against Korea. So my dad said, "You know, after the subsidy is over, after the war is over, the price of farms will decline again, and it's not a good idea for us to invest our money now." And so he never did purchase the farm. But my mom, fortunately, was a seamstress, and she was able to get a job in a clothing factory. And we lived in New Jersey for a few years, and then I went on to Indiana University for a while, and then subsequently to the University of Pittsburgh, and got my MD over there, and then practiced in LA as a family physician. And then one day I was working in the emergency room, and they brought in an ophthalmologist who had lacerated his hand. And I'm working on his hand, trying to fix things. And he's telling me how much he enjoyed his practice. So I decided to explore that a little bit further, and talked to several other ophthalmologists in LA, and they all loved their practices and enjoyed doing what they were doing. So I decided this is what I need to do. And I went back and went to Georgetown in DC to study to become an eye doctor. And then I met a guy who was a descendant from the founders of the city of Tulsa, a fellow named Perryman. And this fellow kept telling me, "You know," he said, "you ought to consider going to Tulsa. It's a wonderful town." And finally, when I was ready to go, that's how I got to Tulsa. And here I am. Anyway, thank you very much for your attention.
Do you want to sit?
Okay, thanks.
Sure. Everyone, this is Marta Warner, who was born in Germany in 1931.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Yes, 1931, long time ago. As I grew up and started school, my very first teacher would start the morning and say, "Let us pray, children." And that lasted for a little less than a half a year. The summer vacation rolled around, and after that we had a new teacher. This new teacher was short, she was in uniform, and it now Heil Hitler. And that was the beginning of it all for me. Altogether, it wasn't too bad to start with. Whatever we were taught was okay, except history. Everything we were taught in history was different from what I had known up to this point in my life. My father had taught me how to read very early, and I was already reading before I started school. So consequently, I had ideas and knowledge of some historical events that I had read about, and what we were being taught was totally false. So I would ask a question and wind up in front of the door for asking the question in the first place, but none of my business. So we went along with the school system that way, and eventually we had somebody come to investigate who is going to be ready for higher education. Unfortunately, I was one of the girls selected, and my father didn't like it. At that point in time, higher education in Germany was still expensive. My father tried to get out of it, and he was told by the government that if he could not pay, Adolf would do so, and he had no choice in the matter. And I wound up in a higher education. With that, things changed. The war had taken off, and we were going to be evacuated because the bombing in the city had accelerated. What they did is pick us kids by classroom and send us into different villages. And my mother went to visit me, and in the process was an attack by airplanes on the train in which she was riding, and she was hit. She lost her right arm, the use of her right arm, and my father had been sent to Silesia for work at that time, and he finally got permission to get his family to Silesia because of her injury. So we are now in Silesia, and it's in the late 44s. The Russians are advancing, coming ever closer, and eventually we had to flee. We, that is my mother, with a right arm in a full body cast, my little brother and myself wound up in a freight train, an open freight train, in the winter in East Germany, trying to get away. and as far as the eye could see, people were running with little wagons. There were just people running away from what was happening. Everybody is going westward ho, and westward ho, the airplanes are hitting Dresden and other cities at that point in time. And the whole situation is a disaster, and something important, there's no food, nothing to eat whatsoever. Eventually, the train got into Meissen, which is a little town in Thuringia, and they let us out and put everybody in a school building for the night. And my mother took me and my brother in walking, trying to find a place to get something to eat. We found a bakery with an open window, and my mother picked me up and helped me to get through that window into that store so I could steal a loaf of bread. And that was the first thing we had to eat in days. And after that, we finally made it walking all the way to my mother's sister's house, and we stayed there for a few days. We didn't know what happened to my father, and we left my brother at that place, and my mother took me back, trying to get back to Frankfurt. And at that point in time, there was a train, and she pushed her body inside that train, and they tried to push her back out again, and it turned out to be a soldier's train, and she's putting at her cast, and she tells them she is much wounded as the rest of them, and they couldn't get her out. She stayed in that train with me, and we got out of Thuringia. We got back to Frankfurt, how I'll never know, into our old apartment. We had nothing to eat, there was no food, there was absolutely nothing, and one morning my mother cried, and I went into the living room to see what was going on, and she was having a miscarriage. I didn't know she was pregnant at the time, but here we went. I picked that fetus up, put it in a wash basin, put it under the sink, and then ran trying to get a doctor. And we had an old doctor who was not in the service, he was too old. He came, he did a DNC on the kitchen table, and my mother got a very severe infection. And then we tried to get her into a hospital, and I ran up and down the streets trying with all my heart, trying to find somebody who can help. There was a gentleman, and he knew who had a telephone, and they finally called a hospital, and we did get an ambulance, and we got my mother to a hospital. A little bit later, my father came. He had been in Hamburg. They had given him a gun. He didn't know how to shoot, he wasn't a soldier. And he had tried to get back to Frankfurt by walking at night and sleeping in the forest during the day. And he made his way back and made it home. And I told him what happened to his wife. and he went and got to see her, and everything turned out okay from that moment on. He tried to get us some food. He went to the various villages and started to work for the farmers to get some bread. So we got some food again. And then the Americans came. I had learned English in school at that point in time. It was British English, quite different from American English. However, it worked. I could open my mouth, at least I could ask for a piece of bread. I was hungry, I could ask. And they did. They would give me something to eat. They had sea rations, and I would get the sea ration and hide it under the bed, and at night I would sneak it open and I'd have something to eat. Oh man, that was good. Oh, that was good. If you are hungry, really hungry, and you have no food, something like that is like heaven sent, I guarantee you. So, we did all of that good stuff. We made it. In the end, my mother survived the infection, eventually came back home again. My father decided he's going to get my brother, whom we had left in Thuringen, which at this time now is under Russian occupation. We lived in Frankfurt, that was American occupation. So my father had to go into the Russian occupied territory to get my brother home. And he did that very well. He did go at night and sleep daytime with a bicycle, no less, and made it. And he got my brother, and he got him home, uninjured, no hurt, no nothing. They came home. How he did it, I will never know. And then we were all together again, starting from scratch. At that point, there was no food, none, no food. And my father, like I said, went to the villages to work for the farmers for some bread, for some anything to eat. And it worked. And at one point I went with him, and we were on bicycle, and an American convoy on the Autobahn. We're on the bicycle, and the convoy is there passing us, and I pulled over to the right side to get out of the way and stopped, got off the bike. My father thought I got hit, but I didn't. So when he found me, he was so happy I was still alive. That was one of the worst parts. One of the good parts about the American convoy was these soldiers all threw their cigarette butts out, and some of those butts were really long butts. And you could, hey, that's important because they made food. Yeah. If you had cigarettes, you could black market anything. Guaranteed you can get anything if you had cigarettes. So we were working on that a lot, trying to get cigarettes all the time. So we pick up the butts, we open them up, take cigarette paper, roll cigarettes, sell the cigarettes, get something to eat. It worked. You get to be very creative. If you are hungry, you get creative, I guarantee it. Okay, that's it.
wonderful thing.
Thank you, Marta. Our last speaker is George Krumme, who was born during the Harding administration, 1922. Anyway, thank you, George.
Do you want to check?
Yeah. Better.
Yeah. I've been pleased for a long time that I can still wear my Eisenhower jacket. But it must somehow have been made of inferior material, because after only 78 years, it has shrunk so much that I can't button the bottom two buttons. But still, I can put it on and leave it unbuttoned, so that's not all too bad. Not long after World War II began, the draft board began looking in my direction. And like every boy my age, I was not particularly looking ahead to the draft. So instead, I enlisted in the Air Corps. And let me see if I can get this on so I can see my notes. Very shortly after I had enlisted, I was accepted into an Air Corps training program and assigned to a college in California, Pomona College as a matter of fact, for a year training program, planning on being, or we were assured that we'd probably be given a commission at the end of the year. But as we ended it, in the beginning of 1943, they not only canceled our program, they canceled all programs similar to that and reassigned us to different places in the ground forces, because after all, the Air Corps at that time was the Army Air Corps. It didn't become the Air Force until after the war. And they had every right, shall we say, to transfer us. Some of us, quite a few of us, were transferred into the infantry, including 5 of the members that I had been in where we were. And I was sent to a camp in Oregon, trained to be a machine gunner in the 274th Infantry Regiment of the 70th Infantry Division. Now, I've emphasized a little bit, at least in my mind, the word infantry, because that was the least desirable branch of the service to be in. The infantry in World War II composed about 14% of the armed forces, the full armed forces, including the Navy. And it suffers, though, 70% of the casualties. So it was the last place most of us cared to be. About 300 others in similar circumstances were transferred to the same place where I was at Camp Adair, Oregon. And we had, our morale, I might say, was rather low, as you can imagine. And about the 300 of us, after we'd been there a week or two, were called by name to go to the
camp baseball field and sat in the bleachers, and a group of officers showed up at the pitcher's mound, and one of the officers asked or introduced the officer who was going to orient us and it turned out that the person orienting us was none other than 4-star General George C. Marshall, who was in charge of the entire army in Washington. And he was going to talk to us. He said, "Men, your country needs you. We've been fighting the enemy for over a year, and we've learned a few things. We've learned that we do control the air and we control the sea, both in the Pacific and in the Atlantic. But we are inferior to the infantry, both in the German infantry and the Japanese infantry, both in numbers, but principally in quality. It happened that all the upper brass in history denigrated the necessity of having quality in the infantry, and draftees and volunteers who had the least abilities were transferred into the infantry, because after all, how much talent does it take to fire a rifle? You pull a bullet, you point it and pull it. But what he had found is that the Germans and the Japanese, not he, but the entire armed forces, had learned that the quality of the man who was the infantry made a lot of difference in their effectiveness. And it's for this reason that we have made the infantry a much higher in position as far as our respect for it and our need for it. And that is the reason that you all are here. Your country needs you. We expect you to do your duty. And that ended the pep talk. So we all went back into training and adjusted as best you can to what essentially was not a good decision for most of us. But General Marshall was correct in that the Army had decided to upgrade the status of the infantryman. And I'm sorry, can you back it up? There. They created a combat infantryman badge, which is the top in the picture there, which every infantryman on the front lines who was actually facing the enemy could wear for the rest of his life. And in addition to that, they increased the pay a private got only of the enlisted men, not of the officers. But a private was drawing $50 a month, and they increased it 20%. He got $60 a month as long as he was on the front lines. Now, Washington had already decided early that they were going to concentrate on the European war effort rather than on the Pacific. And therefore, even though we were on the West Coast in Oregon, they shipped us all the way to Boston, and we were transferred by boat, ship, through the Strait of Gibraltar and landed at Marseille in southern France, and sent by train northeast all the way to the province of Alsace, where we were headed for the Rhine River right on the border of Germany. We passed through at the last minute the Vosges Mountains, which is a narrow, long range of mountains that that parallels the Rhine on the west side. We did not know on the train that while we were on our way to the front, the Battle of the Bulge had started on December 16th. And we arrived at the front along the Rhine about 100 miles east of the Bulge, through the Vosges. We had no idea that the Vosges would be so important to us. But by the time that we arrived, Hitler could see that he was apt to lose the Battle of the Bulge. We arrived on Christmas Eve of 1944, and he had made a decision to have an offensive attack through the Vosges Mountains, which was much surprise, a complete surprise to the American forces, because the Vosges, although the North Vosges really were more giant hills than they were peaks. But even so, the roads were crooked, they were covered with snow and ice at the time, and they were ineffective for tank warfare, which is very important. Therefore, since the Army had shifted Patton's Third Army to the west to help fighting the Battle of the Bulge, the Seventh Army, which ran through the Vosges and along the Rhine, was so thin that we were so thin throughout the Vosges that when the Germans attacked in the Operation Nordwind, was what Hitler had named it, they made 10 miles in only 2 days under very limited resistance. And during that period, of course, the United States Army began shifting people from the west and from the east to stop the drive. And our particular battalion, on the 3rd day of January, the attack occurred late on New Year's Eve, December 31st, about 11 o'clock. And by the 2nd day, it came our turn to be sent by trucks west into the Vosges to help stop the German attack. It had been our own Oklahoma 45th Division was in the middle of the drive at the time, and they had held them temporarily, and I'm speaking of a matter of hours and as much as days. But at the time that we were arrived at Puberg, which is a village probably of 100 people, on a ridge that led down to a little town on a pass, the railroad ran through it, through the Vosges, at a little town called Vingen. I imagine it had about 800, if my memory. At any rate, while we were on the trucks, a German unit had infiltrated in the snow. It was snowing from beginning about 11 o'clock at night. Thank you. And single file, 725 German SS mountain troops infiltrated and captured the little town of Wingen. A company there of the 45th Division was 250 soldiers were put in the basement of the Catholic Church, and this unit held had held it now for about an hour. We got there probably about 11 o'clock, and this had occurred about 7 o'clock in the morning at daybreak. It was January, of course, and surprised all the members of that company still in bed. It was a headquarters company, not a frontline company. It was several miles behind the line. At any rate, this group of German soldiers was the full, what was left of the 12th Regiment of the 6th SS Mountain Division that had just arrived from Finland. If you'll remember, Finland made a peace with Russia in late 1944, and these German soldiers had marched about 1,000 miles. It took them 3 months, and then by train had gone to Germany and had just arrived at the front as Operation Nordwind began. They were so fresh from Finland, they did not even have helmets. The helmets were in some railroad car somewhere, and they came only with garrison caps, the cloth caps that we all wore in the barracks and in the garrison. But they also were there, they had no radios, they also had no support. They had come in single file marching in the snow, and they had only the guns and ammunition that they could carry on their own bodies. So they were limited, but on the other hand, they probably were the most back, please. Back of that. I'm still on that map. There we go. At any rate, they were probably the most experienced soldiers on the entire Western Front at the time. The American forces ahead of us had spent, after they captured it that morning, a couple of days before it became our turn. On the morning of the third day that we were there, Company F of our battalion attacked probably about 9 o'clock in the morning. And at any rate, within a half an hour, 18 of them were killed and some 30 were wounded. And they captured several blocks of the little village, but the order was, hold up, we'll send in the reinforcements after lunch. We actually had K rations, and then our company G that afternoon about 2 o'clock began to go through Company F and clear the village. And of course, dark comes early in that far north in January, but in several hours we had cleared most of the village and sent numerous prisoners to the rear. But as dark began, the light really mostly was from burning houses that had been set by artillery fire. The Germans counterattacked on our left flank. We were inexperienced, realized this was our first contact with the enemy. They were experienced, we were as green as gourds. But we outnumbered them and we had been successful. The counterattack, though, caught us completely by surprise. Our 2 machine gunners in my company G were both wounded and dropped their machine guns and began to go to the rear. They were not killed, they were just wounded. And I happened to be across one of the machine guns. I never knew whether it was my machine gunner oh, I left out something. I was no longer a machine gunner. When we went overseas, I had been promoted to be the squad leader of the machine gunner. I had a machine gunner directly underneath me and an assistant machine gunner and 2 ammo bearers to carry boxes of ammunition up to us. But at any rate, I was not the machine gunner, and my machine gunner had left his rifle, dropped his rifle when he was wounded to go on to the rear. But I ran across one of the machine guns and lay down behind it. The light machine gun has a tripod at the front of the barrel, and you lie down behind it and fire a gun lying down behind it. The water cooled, has water around it to keep the barrel cool, but it's big enough that it's on a tripod, and the rifle company has no heavy machine guns. That was all in a heavy weapons company, a separate company in a rifle division. At any rate, I fired a half of a belt, probably about 250 bullets, just in the general direction, because it was dark and the Germans were in a solid line coming in. They were spread out. At any rate, you can tell a difference on the American machine guns than the German guns. The Germans had many more German machine guns than we did. And like the Thompson machine guns, they were handheld, whereas we had a few. The tanks actually had, tankers had Thompson machine gun, but we did not. At any rate, the German guns fired about 800 rounds per minute, ours fired about 500 rounds a minute, and theirs went brrrr, ours went da 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 da, and you could easily tell the difference between the German guns and our guns. My firing of the machine gun was the only firing in that counterattack, because the heavy weapons companies couldn't see where we were. They were behind us. They couldn't see where we were or where the Germans were, so they didn't fire a single shot, so far as I know. But at any rate, since our troops could recognize my firing, they presumed that I had stopped the counterattack, because the Germans did stop about that time and retreated back to the hills above the village and the part of the village that we had not cleared. And anyhow, there were a couple of consequences. The Germans had been sent that early that morning in the dark, a message from headquarters behind the front lines: we do not have enough resources. Retreat from Wengen, come back through the lines as best you can, because we have given up on this Operation Nordwind as to that part of it. At any rate, it was too late for them to leave, and that's why they were still there when we attacked that day. Actually, the whole thing, had we known that, we would have had to let them go back. But nevertheless, we fought on both sides. The most serious losses on both sides occurred on a day after the Germans had been ordered to retreat. At any rate, a couple of consequences, as I say. One was our battalion the next morning cleared the rest of the village of only wounded, because all the German troops had gone back single file again and retreated into the into the German portion of the front. 725 had come, 225 made it back. They lost 500 killed, wounded, or captured, and we did capture an awful lot of them. But we probably lost more killed and wounded than they did, but none of us none of our troops were actually captured. They were happy to get away. They got away with no prisoners whatsoever. Our battalion was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation for our accomplishment of driving out of it. And this little blue patch here, badge on my right side, every member of our battalion is able to wear that for the rest of their lives. But there was another consequence that was important to me. I was granted a Silver Star Medal for doing my firing against the enemy there. And at the same time that I was awarded the Silver Star, I was offered a commission as a second lieutenant, a battlefield commission. Actually, that was not particularly unique. So many officers had been wounded and killed on the entire Western Front that the officer candidate schools couldn't keep up. And many sergeant or an enlisted man was offered a battlefield commission. I was a sergeant in the morning, and that afternoon I was a second lieutenant. I never went for any training whatsoever. It was literally a battlefield commission. But at any rate, that was our first experience. And as I say, we had only been on the front about 10 days or so when that occurred. But a few weeks later, there was another incident that was very important to me, although it wasn't necessarily very important in the war effort.
George, you've got about 1 minute there.
5 minutes. Oh, I hope you'll forgive me a little bit of running over. It won't be but a minute or two. We were attacking Saarbrücken in Lorraine to the west. This would have been after the spring had occurred. I think it was probably March. At any rate,
You got it.
we had been spending the night in foxholes and dugouts, and I was offered the chance with a section of my platoon to spend the night in a bunker, a concrete bunker. That next morning, I'm ready to go ahead. You see, I have not.
No, it's okay.
Have neglected my duties. Go ahead one more. This is a pillbox. No, I want to go back to that.
I'm trying to correct you.
There we are. That was taken in 2002 with my wife. That is a pillbox, and it was similar to that where I spent the night. The next morning, one of our soldiers had brought a couple of prisoners from the front. This was about 150 yards perhaps behind the actual firing front. And a couple of Germans had offered to surrender and been successful in getting it done. And he had found our company commander, who was in the bunker with us, to send somebody back with the prisoners, but our communications sergeant spoke German, and he wanted to interrogate those two prisoners, so we began talking to him in German. But the Geneva Convention says name, rank, and serial number is all you have to give as a prisoner. And he got no reply really whatsoever, so he began to point to him and shout to him, and finally he was shouting in German whatever he said. Now consider the problem that one of our machine gunners, probably 30 or 40 yards behind us, what's all that shouting in German going on in front of me? And with not knowing what to do, he just turned the machine gun in that general direction and pulled the trigger and fired. Brrr. And we were lucky. None of us were killed, but one of the German prisoners was wounded. He could still walk. And I got a piece of a bullet, I thought, in my cheek that presumed was a piece that had hit the bunker concrete and split and gone in there, because it was just a little puncture that was bleeding, and a medic who happened to be near came by and put a piece of bandage on it and a piece of adhesive tape over it, and we all went about our business winning the rest of the war. But after the war, I was transferred to regimental headquarters, and Colonel Conley, the regimental commander, in a conversation just asked me, were you ever wounded? So I told him that story. No, really. When he asked me, did a medic treat it? I said, yeah, he put a sort of a Band-Aid on it. And I got a call a few hours later, and a staff member said, Colonel Conley wants to see that you get a Purple Heart. Well, I was not prone to be insubordinate, so I agreed, well, I accepted. So I have a Purple Heart, the same as a guy who lost hands and legs and was killed, whatever, but I still have it, and it's on my chest here. At any rate, I was telling one guy in my outfit about it after the war, and he said it probably was not a chip of a bullet, it was probably a piece of concrete off of that wall. Well, now, it's no major honor to be wounded by a piece of a bullet, but to be wounded by a piece of concrete and get a Purple Heart was humiliating. But about 20 years later, I was at my dentist, and he brought in his x-ray and looked at it and said, Krumme, did you know you had a piece of metal in your jaw? So it was. I could have done it. I was, now you can turn one more ahead. I want to go to that. Actually, I was still in the army in Germany, and the war was still on, but we were not on the front line. Now then, I was in a foxhole sometime after everything we've said, and a German sniper fortunately had bad enough aim that he got the top of my helmet instead of my forehead, and the bullet went through the helmet, between the helmet and the helmet liner, and lodged in my wool scarf, and it was so hot it burned in the scarf and fixed permanently. But at least I was lucky enough that he didn't have perfect aim.
George, can I hold up the helmet here? Yeah,
oh yeah, I wore it for the rest of the war. After all, the odds on having another bullet come in the same place were so little that it didn't bother me at all to wear it. And as you can see, I wore it all the way home. Technically, my guess is that belongs to the Army, but they didn't object. It's unusual. I attribute my survival through the war, and we were only there on the front lines 3 or 4 months. You realize I was lucky enough to get there late, and our company, our whole division, never made it past the Rhine. We were up at Mainz at the end of the war, and we were not sent east, so I actually ended a little early, thank goodness. But I was lucky to survive, and I've been lucky to have lived as long as I have. I'm 100 years old.
Oh.
I was born in 1973. Anyhow, now you can turn to the next one. This was taken when I was at regimental headquarters and the war was over. But it's been a pleasure for me. You can tell I'm quite a ham. I've enjoyed presenting what I have, and I've appreciated much your listening to all of it.